So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the Centre for Research in Autism and Education's 7th annual lecture. It's wonderful to see so many people here, particularly on a day like today, which might be described as rather grim for a whole host of reasons. I'm Liz Pellicano and I run the Centre for Research in Autism and Education here at UCL. For those of you who don't know CRAE, we aim to produce research findings that will be discussed by autistic people, their family members, friends, and those who support them, i.e. you. We aim to do research that informs education and health policy, both in the UK and internationally. And we also aim to ensure that the work that we do makes a difference to the lives lived by autistic people, wherever they are in the world. Which is why I'm absolutely delighted today to introduce Professor Francesca Happé, who will speak on growing old on the autism spectrum. Francesca is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience and Director of the MRC Social, Genetic and Developmental Psychiatry Centre at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London. For the vast majority of you, I'm sure she will need no introduction whatsoever. Francesca has conducted pioneering work on the nature of social insight and awareness of autistic people, and is perhaps most well known for her work on cognitive strengths in autism, particularly autistic people's eye for detail. You may not know, however, that she is also a champion of and inspiration for women in science, and in 2011 won the Royal Society's Rosalind Franklin Award to create books for primary school children called My Mum's a Scientist, which I want to buy. I think is awesome. Very much looking forward to those. Francesca's always been at the very forefront of autism research, and her lecture tonight on autism and ageing is no exception. Although some of us try very hard not to think about it, we all wonder what our lives will be like when we face old age, and autistic people do too. But the extremely limited research on autism and ageing means that we know almost nothing about the specific needs of older autistic people and the best ways of supporting them, which is why Francesca's work is so important. So we'll hear Francesca talk about her research for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions both from the audience and from Twitter, if there's any questions from Twitter, until around about 7:15, so there might be 15-20 minutes of her questions. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Francesca Happé.
Thank you, Liz. And it's an enormous pleasure and privilege to be asked to give this lecture, because I'm a huge fan of the work that CRAE has done, and particularly I think Liz has just taken the work of CRAE in a fantastic direction with enormous energy and enthusiasm, so that CRAE is doing something that I don't see anywhere else in the world, any other organization in the world doing. So I think that's fantastic, and it therefore makes it a real privilege as well as a pleasure to give this lecture. So I'm going to talk about growing old on the autism spectrum. And this is a topic that I became very interested and concerned about 5 years ago, when I realized that there really was hardly any research at all to tell us what happened to people on the spectrum as they entered old age, which coincided with my mother breaking her leg very badly and ending up in hospital for several weeks, surrounded by elderly people. I never really thought of her as an elderly person, but there she was, and I realized how badly we treat the elderly in this country in general, and how vital it is to have somebody to champion you in this country if you're old and powerless. And I thought about what it would be like to be in that hospital if you had autism, if you maybe didn't have family to come and fight for you, and if you were finding the sensory environment not only unwelcome, as all of the patients I'm sure did, but absolutely excruciating. So that was when I got excited and interested about growing old in autism, with autism. And today I will talk to you a little bit about the scale of the issue and the methodological challenges. Then I'll tell you about some of the latest findings and work in progress. And for an audience where I know you're all experts, but all coming from different perspectives, I would usually have a more broad brush kind of approach, but there is so little research in this area that I hope you won't mind if I go into a bit of detail, because actually we just don't have facts yet, and I want to give you whatever facts we have. And I'll talk a little bit about future directions. So we know, of course, that around 1% of children have autism, and that's autism defined by social and communication difficulties and rigid and repetitive behavior. But often people forget that 1% of adults also have autism. Now, if ever there was a time to start worrying and thinking about the elderly, it's now, because we know that the population around the world is growing old. And in this country, according to Age UK, there are now more pensioners than children under the age of 16. And a third of the UK population is 50 years or older. That's more than 22 million people. And so if 1 in 100 people are on the autism spectrum, then more than 200,000 adults, older adults, have autism. So although we often think about young people with autism, I think it's time to think about the elderly. Most individuals with autism are adults. And according to Terry Breuer's ONS survey, most adults on the autism spectrum are undiagnosed. So given that scale of need, what do we know about aging and autism? Well, this very useful paper by Carol Povey and colleagues looked at the number of publications by the age of the participants that were involved in the research up until 2011. And you can see the incredible shortage of studies with enrolling older adults compared to lots and lots of research with children and adolescents, even with autism. So we're facing a sort of black hole, a huge gap in our knowledge and understanding. And Joe Piven, in a white paper from 2011, reflected this when they wrote, an understanding of the epidemiological, biological, psychological, and social aspects of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, in older adults is essential for preparing to meet their needs. However, studies on ASDs in these individuals are practically non-existent. So why do we know so little about old age on the spectrum? Well, one obvious reason is that autism was first named by Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner at the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 1940s. So the first cohorts of children who were diagnosed in the 50s, 60s, 70s are only now growing old. Parents have been incredibly important in pushing forward research and in championing provision and the focusing people's attention on autism. And of course, the parents of that first generation are now seeing their children grow old, and some of the parents sadly aren't around to see their children grow old and to champion research to help their children who are now elderly. I also think that the early term for autism, early infantile autism, reflects the fact that autism has remained the preserve of child psychiatrists and pediatricians and child psychologists, so that adults, clinicians up to now, haven't really thought they needed to know about autism. I also believe it's harder to get funding to study older adults, and I hope I'm wrong about that, but I have the sense that autism in the elderly isn't seen as attractive and appealing in the same way as it is when you think about a young child on the autism spectrum. And I think there's also an inherent belief that somehow research with young people with autism can really make a difference, that we can change the life course, but that research with older adults can't, and I think there is no evidence for that at all. We just don't know what early intensive education and intervention for elderly people with autism could achieve. It might achieve wonderful things. So there are methodological challenges for research. First of all, the cohort that were diagnosed in childhood, when they, in the 1960s, for example, were diagnosed according to diagnostic criteria that are much narrower than the diagnostic criteria we have now, where we have more of a notion of an autism spectrum. And so it's hard to compare those who are now old, who were diagnosed as children, with the young people and adults who are being diagnosed at this time with those broader criteria. It's also important to think about the method of recruitment that's used in our research, because it may be difficult to reach a representative population. So some early attempts to gather information include work for the Welsh Assembly government, where they try to use questionnaires and in-person interviews and analyze existing databases. Some of that work suggested that when they compared individuals with intellectual disability with or without autism, it was mainly adaptive functioning rather than the diagnosis that predicted mental health and quality of life. And a survey attempted with adults on the spectrum really had a disappointing response, only 29 responses. And you can see that issue about sampling. Most of them were only in their 40s, not really much older, and most identified as having Asperger's syndrome or being at the end of the autism spectrum without intellectual disability. So are we reaching a representative sample to really find out about autism? Even with those perhaps most able to take part participants, those researchers still found problems with employment and mental and physical health. We also have information from individual case histories. So this is Donald T., who was Leo Kanner's case 1 in his famous groundbreaking case series published in 1943. And in this photograph, he's age 77. And if you haven't read the beautiful magazine article by John Donovan and Carol Zucker, which also forms part of their book in a different key, it's really worth reading because Donald Triplett has managed to have a really happy old age, a very autistic old age. He still is very engaged in seeing the world in his own individual neurodiverse way, but because of the environment he's in and the acceptance of the town that he lives in, he has a very happy life. And he's continued to gain all sorts of skills in later life, to learn to drive, to be able to travel independently, learned late in adult life. Now, the more systematic studies of autism have begun with following up children who were diagnosed in those early years of the autism diagnosis being used. And perhaps most notable is Pat Howland's follow-up of the so-called Maudsley cohort, children who were diagnosed in the 1950s to the 1970s and have been followed up for around 40 years now. When she went back to those individuals in their 20s and 40s, she found relatively poor outcome. Now that means that few lived independently or were able to find employment at that time. And even though their autism symptoms were often found to be decreasing, somehow their outcome and their life quality wasn't improving. And outcome was strongly linked to intellectual level. So if you had additional intellectual disability, then your chances of a good outcome as measured were lower. Here you can see a paper from that cohort looking at cognitive and language skills, and I just want you to note the diversity of trajectories, that many people are staying stable in terms of their cognitive profile, but others may be going down or going up over the years. And she looked at social outcome in later adulthood, found that all the individuals still met diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum condition, but 60% still had a poor outcome, even though the severity of autism symptoms, as I say, had declined. The other adult longitudinal study that's very impressive is from Christopher Gilberg's team, where, of course, in Scandinavia, they can do really good population-based follow-ups. And they followed 120 individuals who were diagnosed with autism in childhood. And age 17 to 40, so you can see we're not really into old age yet. Outcome, again, was rated poor for many individuals. And IQ, again, a strong prognostic factor. And the last of these existing studies I want to mention was by Catherine Hippler, who, interestingly, was able to look back at the records from Hans Asperger's diagnostic clinic and intervention clinic and follow some of those individuals and see where they had ended up. Now, again, this is a group not yet in old age, mean age of 42, but she found that employment outcome and relationship outcome was often very good, which is interesting. And she also specifically looked at interactions with the criminal justice system and found that autism wasn't associated with higher rates of criminal conviction, which is important, I think, when you think about the fact that when there's a lone gunman, a lone bomber, the press are very fast to say, oh, this person is socially isolated, maybe this person is on the autism spectrum. And all the evidence is, of course, that people on the autism spectrum are much more likely to be the victims of crime than the perpetrators. There's a review of the adult outcome studies, which found 25 outcome studies, and again, the same general conclusions. Cognitive scores seem to be stable into at least middle adulthood. Adaptive skills and autism symptoms improve, and yet social outcomes are relatively poor. And these authors conclude that we need to know much more about quality of life and social and emotional factors in the long-term outcome of children with autism as they grow into adulthood and beyond. So, as I say, there are methodological challenges. Those studies started with populations that were diagnosed some time ago according to narrower criteria. How much can they tell us about how autism is currently diagnosed and what older adulthood looks like for those who meet the current diagnostic criteria? So, Meng-Shui Lai and Simon Baron-Cohen have identified some of the difficulties with, as they say, identifying the lost generation of adults. So this is the idea that in the future, if our diagnostic services for children are good, we will know about all the individuals who are on the autism spectrum as they get into old age. But for now, because our diagnostic processes have changed and our idea of the spectrum has broadened, there's a whole generation, several generations, that we have to catch up with who were missed and weren't helped in their younger years. So they make the point that making a first diagnosis of autism spectrum conditions in adults can be challenging for practical reasons, because there's nobody to provide a developmental history in some cases. For developmental reasons, because of the acquisition of learned or camouflaging strategies. And for clinical reasons, because often individuals have co-occurring disorders, and there can be diagnostic overshadowing where an individual's obsessive-compulsive disorder, anxiety, depression mask, as it were, to the clinician, their additional autism. So the clinician stops with the depression and doesn't ask whether this is a depression in an individual on the autism spectrum. So there have been some studies of those diagnosed with ASD for the first time in adulthood, and typically found somewhat better outcome for these individuals, which makes sense because our diagnostic criteria now allow individuals who are less severely affected, who may not have intellectual disability, who may have good language and other skills. Educational attainment can be relatively high, and living independently, again, becomes more common. But lifetime rates of associated psychiatric difficulties are still high in that one study. So mood disorders in more than half of these adults coming for first diagnosis in adulthood. So I want to tell you about two studies that we've done that have looked at those individuals who are coming for first diagnosis to adult autism diagnostic clinics. We can be sure in these studies that the criteria for diagnosis applied across the age span of adults from 18 to 80 are the same diagnostic criteria. So in that sense, it's a level playing field. But there are, of course, issues about this being a selective sample of individuals who've managed to get to these services, and I'll return to that question a bit later on. So Dr. Rebecca Charlton from Goldsmiths, led fantastic work with the Autism Diagnostic Research Centre in Southampton to look at the records of adults who'd come for first diagnosis, autism. There were almost 150 adults who'd given consent for us to look at their anonymized data, and we looked at 100 adults who did end up with an autism spectrum diagnosis, and 46 adults who came autism, but actually after a whole day's assessment, the clinical view was that this wasn't actually autism, it was something else. So the age ranges you can see there from 18 to 70 or so, and you can see that around 20-25% of both samples are females. IQ wasn't always assessed if there wasn't a question about intellectual disability, because this is a clinic primarily for individuals without intellectual disability. But where it was measured, the IQ in the two groups is roughly similar. And both groups had individuals of whom about 50% were working or studying. But only 15% of the autism group were in full-time paid employment, which is very much in line with figures that the National Statistics Society has from wider and other samples of adults with autism. Additional psychiatric problems were very common in both groups. Around almost 60% had some additional psychiatric difficulty, with around 30% having depression and 20 to 30% having anxiety. here you can see the age effects. If we look at age across that wide range, and we can look at the relationship between age and symptoms as self-reported on the Autism Spectrum quotient, which is Simon Baron-Cohen's instrument. And what Rebecca found was that AQ scores, so severity of self-reported symptoms, increased with age in the individuals who did have an autism diagnosis, but not in those who came question mark autism but didn't have an autism diagnosis at the end. And this was also true for the systemizing quotient, which is the trying to tap the part of autism that's more to do with detail-focused processing style and strengths, and also maybe repetitive interests. We also have some data for a subsample on a couple of subtests of cognitive functioning. The digit symbol test, which measures speed to use a sort of key or code to move between a shape and a number, and also block design, which, as you know, is thought to measure eye for detail, an ability to see the parts in a whole. And in both of these tasks, again, we find an age effect only in the autism sample, but now in the opposite direction, where those who are older are actually doing better on these cognitive tasks. And that's perhaps surprising, given what we might think of as the expected cognitive decline in speeded tasks in the neurotypical population. So the AQ results suggest that self-rated symptoms are worse in older adults, but some IQ subtests suggest cognition is better in older adults in this sample. So how do we interpret those findings? Do symptoms really worsen with age, or maybe insight into symptoms, since it's a self-rating, increases with age? We can't tell between those because we only have self-rated symptoms in this particular study. Or it could be that for older adults, the symptom bar for referral to this specialist service is actually set higher, so that the GP or whoever it is who's going to make this referral is actually not really thinking about autism when they see the oldest adults. And so they need to see more by way of symptoms to push them to actually make that referral. And we can't tell between those different explanations. And the better performance on some cognitive tests, well, it could be that better cognitive skills allow survival to a later age before the need for clinical referral. That's one possibility, that these individuals who are older with better cognitive skills have managed to cope because of their better cognitive skills. Or it's possible that cognitive skills are actually improving over time relative to neurotypical norms. And we don't know, again, because this is cross-sectional. So here's a second study based in a diagnostic clinic for first diagnosis of autism in adulthood. And I have to thank Declan Murphy for allowing us to work with the clinic at the Maudsley. And I want to credit Ezra Yara, my PhD student, who, in the absence of our finding any funding from anywhere to do work on old age and autism, came and brought her own PhD studentship from the Turkish government and set about doing some really hard work around old age and autism. So this is one of her studies, and you'll hear about other ones too. But she began by looking at the case notes in the diagnostic clinic for adults, the Autism Diagnostic Clinic for Adults. And she started off by finding all the case notes she could for those who'd consented to share their data for older individuals. So anybody over 50, she pulled out their notes. And once she had that group, she set about making a group of younger individuals who also ended up with an autism diagnosis to compare them with. And then, just like the other clinics, some individuals who come to the Autism Diagnostic Clinic end up not with a diagnosis of autism, but a diagnosis of something else. Sometimes social anxiety, ADHD, sometimes nothing at all, rarely. And so, as a comparison group, she also pulled up the elderly that she could find there and a young group for comparison. So you can see that the young group are mean age around 24, the older group mean age around 55 in both the autism and the non-autism samples. Now, when these individuals come into the diagnostic clinic, the younger individuals typically are given an ADI because there's a parent there who can report about developmental history. The older adults often can't be given ADI because there's no one to report, and instead they may have an ADOS, an Autism Diagnostic Observation schedule. So we can't compare directly across those two. So all we have that everybody has done is that the clinicians have completed a checklist of diagnostic criteria using the ICD-10 diagnostic criteria. So that forms our sort of symptom measure. It's not perfect, but it's what we have. And at least now we have something for contrast that's not self-report, but clinician report. So we can see whether some of our previous findings were really about self-report or whether they hold up with clinician report. So what Ezra found was that in terms of autism symptoms, split into social impairment, communication impairment, and rigid and repetitive behaviors, although those who ended up with an autism diagnosis had more symptoms of autism than those who didn't, which is not surprising, there were no significant age effects. So you can see here the effect sizes. And for rigid and repetitive behavior in particular, there is a moderate effect size, and that matches some other reports. But in this sample size, no significant differences by age and no interaction of age by group. We thought that maybe the differences between young and old would be different for the autism group versus the non-autism group, but that didn't turn out to be the case. And then we've also looked at the additional diagnoses that clinicians have given to these individuals that came to the autism clinic. And you can see immediately that a lot of individuals had an additional diagnosis. This is firstly the autism group split into young and old, and 26% of the young and 44% of the old had more than one additional diagnosis, and some had more than 2 additional diagnoses. But the severity of difficulties in ADHD, depression, OCD, and anxiety, which were the ones common enough to compare, wasn't significantly different by age. It didn't relate to age. And the same, is broadly true in the non-autism control group, where, again, other diagnoses are relatively common, but they weren't related to age. So here you can see all 4 cells together, the young and the old, split by autism and non-autism. And you can see really that, as we've seen before, depression and anxiety, major problems in autism, as we know, but major problems in the young and the old. These problems aren't going away. So conclusions from this study, the autism symptoms are pretty similar in the younger and older groups coming for first diagnosis. That perhaps reassures us a little bit about selection effects. It's not the case that the young individuals have really severe symptoms, and the older individuals who've managed to survive this long without getting to a diagnostic clinic actually have mild symptoms, whatever mild symptoms would be, because since it depends on how society allows you to flourish. But there were no diagnoses by age interactions, but lots of additional mental health conditions, as prominent in the old as the younger adults. Now, there are lots of limitations to this kind of study. It's a cross-sectional design. The control group in this study had been referred because somebody thought that they did have autism. So they have some sorts of difficulties that are least reminiscent of autism. So in some sense, they're quite a conservative comparison group. This study is based only on patient notes. And we didn't see the individuals in person for this study. And when you think about a clinic sample, that is a selected sample. They're individuals who've managed to come to the clinic, but also individuals who up until now haven't had a diagnosis. So somehow, either because they're coping or because they've flown under the radar and are suffering in silence, they haven't been known to services before. So let's think about wider cross-sectional group studies that compare young and old adults with autism, not necessarily who are coming for first diagnosis, perhaps including individuals who've had a diagnosis for some time. Well, Hilde Geertz in the Netherlands has really been the pioneer in this area and the first person to get together decent-sized groups comparisons and move beyond single-case studies or surveys. So she's looked, for example, at executive function. Here she's looking in older adults cross-sectionally and finding that attention and fluency in working memory are somewhat worse in older adults with autism than in neurotypical comparison group. But plenty of other areas don't show any difference. So that's a glass half full, half empty sort of story. She was particularly interested in the trajectory, the relationship with age, and suggested 3 possible patterns we might look for. So we know that things like executive function and memory tend to deteriorate in old age in neurotypical individuals. What about in individuals on the autism spectrum? So one hypothesis would be a parallel trajectory. So even if the individuals with autism, as we know from childhood studies, might start off with slightly worse planning and monitoring and ability to be flexible, the deterioration might be in parallel, might be at the same rate. A second possibility, which Hilda calls the double jeopardy hypothesis, is that the individuals who start off worse might then also age faster cognitively. So they might deteriorate faster and end up in an even worse position, even further behind the neurotypical group. And then the last possibility that Hilda outlines is a safeguard hypothesis, she calls it, where the autism group might actually cognitively decline less fast than the neurotypical group. So Hilda's reported results so far from verbal fluency, for example, where she finds a more stable pattern cross-sectionally across age in autism than in the neurotypical controls. So the neurotypical controls are showing a reduction in verbal fluency with age, and the autism group, the older individuals, are doing just as well as the younger individuals in this adult sample. In visual memory, the picture is different, as she reports, where the autism group seems to show a steeper age-related decline, but bear in mind this is cross-sectional, compared to the controls. So different pictures for different sorts of functions. And in another piece of Hilda's work, where they've looked at working memory, they find that, again, the autism group don't show age-related decline in working memory over this span of years, whereas the neurotypical adults do. Their working memory is declining, as we would expect from other research. So a mixed picture. And one last study before I talk about our work. David et al. Just came out with a study of executive function in older adults with autism, all of whom were diagnosed after the age of 30. And they found rather few differences on executive function measures. So at this age point, the individuals with autism were not doing worse on executive tests than the neurotypicals, except they needed a little bit more time for one particular planning test called the Tower of London. What they did find that was interesting was that verbal fluency decreased with age in both groups, but also that the autism group self-reported having worse executive function than did the neurotypicals. So the individuals with autism had the perception that their executive function was poor. Now, it may be that their perception was more accurate than the tests, because in real life you can have all sorts of difficulties that are quite tricky to tap in a structured test. But that obviously needs some more research. So I want to tell you about another study that Ezra completed during her PhD. And all of this work is really hot off the press, and Ezra is analyzing it right now as I speak. So some of the results may change, but I thought I would tell you about what's really new from our research group. So Ezra was interested in mental health and well-being, in social cognition, in eye for detail or weak central coherence. And I'll tell you about just some of those studies. So she managed to recruit almost 60 individuals with autism, split into young and old, about 30 in each group, and about 40 individuals with typical development, split again into young and old. And she did a really good job of matching the young and old groups for IQ, pretty good for SES, and you can see the ages there. So the young are around about 30, and the older group are around about 60 mean IQ, but quite a big spread from 19 to 50 or so, from 50 to 70 something. So in terms of mental health conditions, here you can see the numbers of individuals who had each of these additional mental health problems. And overall, the autism group is having more difficulty than the neurotypical group in terms of rates of anxiety, depression, ADHD, and OCD. But again, as in our clinic study, there was no age effect. So there was no significant difference between the younger and the older groups. And there was no age by group interaction in this particular study. Now, what about quality of life? So important to ask adults, quite apart from their mental health difficulties, how is their life? How are they satisfied or not with their quality of life? And Ezra looked at quality of life in a lot of different domains, but just to summarize here, the global quality of life measures, in most aspects of quality of life, the autism group reported less well-being than the neurotypical group. But again, there was no age effect, and there was no age by group interaction. So young and old adults with autism were reporting a less high quality of life. Now, the one place where there was an interaction, where there was different story for the autism group and the non-autism group, was in the social relationships quality of life measure. So in terms of friendships and so forth. And there we could see that in the autism group, the older adults were actually reporting a better social quality of life than the younger adults with autism. Whereas in the neurotypical group, the young reported better quality of life than the old. So in the neurotypical group, we see what we might expect, that sometimes older age is associated with more social isolation, more loneliness. But in the autism group, that didn't seem to be the case. Now you can see that there's still an overall effect of quality of life being lower in the autism group. But it seems, you could say, that the younger adults with autism most keenly felt their poor social quality of life. What predicts quality of life in these groups? Well, in autism, global psychological and physical quality of life were all best predicted by severity of depression, comorbid depression, which highlights again that it's often the things that go with autism that make life difficult for individuals on the autism spectrum, not the autism itself. And what predicts social relationship quality of life? Well, social symptoms, as measured by the social relationship scale, was the best predictor of social relationship quality of life. Now, Ezra also wanted to test theory of mind, the ability to recognize what other people might be thinking. And we used a number of tasks, but including a very nice film test that Kim Murray recently created based on the strange stories that I wrote a long time ago. So in this example, they're very short little video clips. You always have the same two characters, a man and a woman, and you see them at the kitchen table eating a meal, and he says, this is my mom's favorite recipe. I worked really hard to make this. And then you pan round and you see that she's just moving her food around and not eating it. And he asks her, oh, you're not eating it, don't you like it? And she says, it's wonderful, I'm just not really hungry. And then the test question to the participant is, why did she say that? Then we have some kind of memory control question. But then we also ask, if you were in the conversation, if you were him, what would you say next? So sort of generating a piece of appropriate interaction. So another example of these very short little video clips would be, you see that he's, again, sitting, waiting to have dinner, and he phones her. You then see, cut to her standing in the pub, and she answers the phone and says, oh, I'm just leaving work, it's been crazy. And then you ask, why did she say that? And neurotypical people will tend to say that she's either lying or telling a white lie. Quite often, individuals on the autism spectrum will find other sorts of explanations that are perfectly logical. So they might say, well, she works in a pub, which is perfectly logical, but wouldn't be the explanation that typically first comes to mind for neurotypicals. So using these tasks, Ezra found that the neurotypical individuals found it easier to attribute the intention, to explain why she or he was saying that, than did the autism group in general. And there was an age effect, so that the young found it easier than the old in general, but there was also an interaction of age by diagnostic group. So that you can see in the neurotypical group, the older individuals found this a harder task, a significantly harder task than the younger adults, whereas in the autism group, that wasn't the case. And if you turn to the interaction question, which is the question, what would you say next in that conversation? Here you can see that the older adults on the autism spectrum are actually doing slightly, albeit non-significantly, better than the younger adults. So there's something different happening here in terms of age effects, according to whether you're in the autism group or the neurotypical group. Now, of course, we aren't interested in things that only come out with one particular task. So I'll also tell you about the reading the mind and the eyes test, which again is one of Simon Baron-Cohen's tests. And as you probably know, in this task, you look at static photographs of the eye region of faces, and you have to decide which of 4 words best matches what you think is going on inside the mind of that person. So again, Ezra found that this ability showed some decline in the neurotypicals, so that the older adults found this harder than the younger adults. But again, this wasn't the case in the autism group, where, and actually, the older adults with autism were not significantly worse than the older adults who were neurotypical on this task, even though the young adults with autism were significantly worse than their neurotypical peers. So I want to turn now to weak central coherence, or detail focus. So one of the areas of functioning where we see real strengths in autism, in a different cognitive style that tends to pay attention to and have a facility for remembering and processing levels and aspects of detail in the world that many neurotypicals miss. One of the tasks often used to test this is the embedded figures test, which you can see here, where you have to find the simple lower shape within the larger compound shape. And of course, it's camouflaged by our tendency as neurotypicals to see it as a gestalt, to see the whole, and find it hard to see the parts within that whole. So using the embedded figures task, again, Ezra found that there were age effects in the elderly neurotypical individuals. So particularly in the time it takes you to find that hidden part, the older adults who are neurotypical were slower, significantly slower, with quite a large effect size, than the younger neurotypical adults. But that wasn't the case in the autism group. So we didn't find overall that the autism group were much better than the neurotypical group, which we have found in some other studies in some other age groups. But we did find that the autism group weren't showing that apparent cost or reduction in performance with older age. And again, another test to see whether what we found is specific to one particular task, which wouldn't be interesting. So this was using a task that Rhonda Booth developed, which is a fragmented picture task. So what you see on the screen, if you're doing this task, is just a few fragments to begin with, and then the picture gradually builds up piece by piece, and your job is to press the button to say as quickly as you can, or as soon as you can, what that overall picture is going to be. And we've taken out all the identifying little details, so you really have to put information together. So we think it's a good test of global processing. Ezra used this task again with the same sample, and again she finds that in the neurotypical group there is a cost that comes with older age, so that it took them longer or more processing time, more pieces of information before they could guess what the object was. Whereas in the autism group, there wasn't that age effect. And again, you can see that there's therefore an interaction of age group and diagnostic group. So to summarize those studies by Ezra, additional mental health problems show that individuals with autism are worse affected by depression, ADHD, OCD, anxiety than neurotypical older adults. But there are no specific age differences, at least in this sample. So it's neither getting better nor worse in older age if we can judge by this cross-sectional rather than longitudinal design. And in terms of cognition, social cognition, and local global processing, the neurotypical individuals are better at social cognition than the autism spectrum individuals. But in particular, the young neurotypical individuals are better than the young autism individuals. When you look at the older groups, you don't see such a marked difference, because in autism, performance on these social tasks doesn't seem to be as badly affected by age. So is this a protective effect? Can we say that Hilda's safeguarding hypothesis is true, that somehow age-related decline doesn't happen in autism? Maybe too soon to tell. The last study I want to mention is, again, by Ezra, where she tried to take a dimensional approach. Now, we know that we tend to think about autism now as lying on a dimension of individual differences, so that we all have traits that we would identify with autism spectrum conditions, but some individuals have more traits, and of course, whether or not you seek a diagnosis or want a diagnosis will depend in part on whether those traits are impairing for you in your current niche or environment or context. And of course, that can change also throughout your lifetime. So looking at individuals who don't meet diagnostic criteria but do have many traits of autism, it can also be very informative. So Ezra recruited grandparents of children with autism because since autism has a genetic component in many, many cases, family members of children with autism often identify as having some traits that resemble the traits in their children, whether that's some difficulty in some social situations or sometimes a wonderful eye for detail. So this is really a pilot study. It's a starting study where Ezra managed to recruit about 40-odd grandparents, grandfathers and grandmothers who had at least one biological grandchild diagnosed with autism. And you can see that they're in their 70s on average, but they span all the way from late 50s to their 80s. So I'll just tell you about a couple of findings from this study that, again, she's still analyzing. She used the Broad Autism Phenotype Questionnaire, which is a self-report questionnaire about autistic-like traits, a self-report questionnaire about mental and physical health, and a self-report quality of life measure, which is a composite of lots of different measures. And she found that about 20% of this particular sample would meet the cutoff that's been established in the literature for showing the broad autism phenotype. And those individuals reported more anxiety, depression, OCD, ADHD, more difficulties with executive function in everyday life, planning, monitoring, being flexible, and more alexithymia, which refers to the difficulty reflecting on and talking about your own emotions. So all of these were more common in the grandparents who had high autistic traits compared to those who had low autistic traits. And what determined quality of life among the sample of grandparents? Well, broad autism phenotype, having a lot of autistic traits, self-reported, correlated negatively with self-reported quality of life. So those who said they had a lot of social difficulties also said their quality of life was less good. Quality of life wasn't related to either age or to social impairment as measured with a separate individual differences measure. But quality of life was related to alexithymia, that difficulty identifying your own emotions, to experiencing stressful life events, and to both mental and physical health. And the best predictors of quality of life were broad autism phenotype and mental health, which was often about depression again. So some conclusions and some thoughts for the future. So what I've reported are associations, they're correlations from cross-sectional studies. And they're not necessarily causal. We can't necessarily be sure, even if they are causally related, what the direction of effect is. What we need are longitudinal studies, cross-sectional studies that are taken forward longitudinally, so we can see how the same individual fares as they get older, rather than comparing young and old individuals who may be different because of our sampling approaches or because autism is so enormously heterogeneous. We should be ready for the fact that, at least in my view, autism isn't one thing. It's a constellation of different features of some cognitive deficits and some cognitive differences and styles and assets. And so we need to measure longitudinally in a multidimensional way. And it's going to be really important to understand what the longitudinal pathway is. If there is a causal relationship between the features of autism and poor mental health, for example, what is that pathway? Is it that social impairments act through creating social isolation, which we know in neurotypicals leads to poorer mental health and poorer physical health indeed? Is it insistence on sameness and rigidity that makes the neurotypical world very stressful, and that's the route to poor mental health? Is it that executive dysfunction, problems of disorganization lead to stress, and again to poor mental health? Or is it really about society's response? That people with autism in this society are often treated extremely badly, that they experience exclusion and bullying and victimization and more stressful life events, and that's what leads to poor mental health. So we need to understand the pathway to know how we intervene. So if some of the findings I've told you about today are replicated, and some cognitive functions seem to be preserved or to deteriorate more slowly in autism, why might that be? Well, there are at least 3 explanations I can think of, and you may be able to think of other ones and better ones. But the first, the least interesting, would be a sort of survivor effect. That when you do any research like this, the individuals who are able to take part tend to be those who are coping best in life. And particularly if you're asking individuals in their 70s to come and take part in a research study or even respond to an advert they see in the library, you're selecting those whose lives are managing to go well. And so they are the creme de la creme, as it were. And that's a problem in general in aging research, not just in autism. Another possibility that I find much more exciting is the notion that individuals with autism are engaging effectively in brain training throughout most of their lifetimes. And I base this on the fact that individuals with autism told me, that when they're in a social situation, for them it's like doing mental arithmetic. They're consciously calculating and thinking. They're working really hard to understand what it is that's going on. And we know that people are excited by the possibility that brain training, that exercising your mind with hard things, whether it's crosswords or Sudoku, has a correlation with delaying cognitive aging. Maybe people with autism are doing Sudoku all the time that they're in our neurotypical world trying to understand what the hell the neurotypicals are going on about. And the third possibility is that there's genuinely some difference in the biological process of brain aging. And we just don't know whether that could be true. So what next in aging research? We really need to know what autism spectrum conditions look like in old age. I just don't think we have enough of a picture of that, because clinicians need to know that in order to be able to provide diagnosis where that's appropriate in people who are in their 70s or 80s, to help services recognize and understand the needs of elderly people on the spectrum. We need to know much more about physical and mental health and well-being. Are there unique health needs that come up in later life for adults with autism? Lorna Wing was very interested in catatonia, in movement disorders and freezing. And Joe Piven has reported some preliminary evidence that Parkinson's type symptoms may be more common in old individuals with autism. Now that may be related to use of medications, which particularly in the States, probably greatly overused among adults on the autism spectrum, but it remains a really possibly important clue to something about aging that could be specific to autism. And is there a different presentation of things like dementia? I've made a point of asking, whenever I talk to people who work in dementia clinics, do you see individuals on the autism spectrum? And by and large, they say, no, I've never seen anyone on the autism spectrum. Well, how can that be? How can that be unless autism looks either so different when a dementia happens as well, or that autism is no longer evident to the people who maybe don't know what to look for? So we just don't know. We need to know what that complex picture might look like. And I think there's real potential for new insights both into autism and into aging. People have been very excited about findings from the beginning of life about brain growth trajectories in young children with autism. But just as exciting and important to know what's happening late in life. This is an overlooked population for sure, and many, many people aren't accessing services, and we're not even finding them for our research when we try to. And perhaps most crucially, we need to know what adults with autism themselves consider a good old age. Because I've told you about research by many groups that's looked at good and poor outcome. But that tends to be a neurotypical view of good and poor outcome, where things like living independently or having a paid job are considered good outcome. But maybe that's not what really matters. Or maybe it is. We need to ask individuals on the autism spectrum and find out from older adults with autism what really matters to them. So I began feeling passionate about old age and autism because of seeing the way my mother and other elderly people who didn't even have the additional challenges of a social and communication barrier were treated, and really worrying about the double stigma in our society of having any kind of neurodiversity that others don't understand and being an unfavored group within society, being old. But maybe we can also be optimistic. So this is a photograph, a work of art by Chendur Venkatraman, a photograph taken in Helping Hands Hospital for individuals with mental illness taken off the streets in Bangalore. And the quote from the person photographed that is the title of the artwork is, "Old age is not a disease. It is strength and survivorship, triumph of all kinds of vicissitudes and disappointments, trials and illnesses." So I finished by thanking you all, thanking the individuals who've taken part in the research and their families, the National Autistic Society for championing autism in adulthood and old age, and nice to see Cos here who's taken that work forward. My colleagues and students, and especially Ezra and Rebecca who's here, and all those who funded our work, Liz for inviting me, and all of you for listening, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.